Hello guys, my name is Diego Pacheco and this is another slidecast. And in this slidecast, we're gonna talk about dealing with team dependencies. On the previous slidecast, I was showing some techniques and some considerations when we had to deal with team dependencies in tests. And now, I wanna talk in a more broader picture, covering some management, some DevOps CI/CD aspects of it, some architecture aspect of this, and some practice that we could do, things that I think it work, and things I think it does not work. Right? So let's get started. So the first thing I think is important, this is old as the snakes, right? It is the Conways Law. It's from 1967, right? So it's very old, but still not hard to find people that are not familiar with it and not really doing anything, accepting it or to change structures and that being part of the solution, right? So basically, the Conway's law says that the structure of software will mirror the structure of the organization, right? So let's say your organization has 3 silos, right? You have like sales, you have accounting, and you have HR. And that often could be that you have a sales, accounting, HR services, and they depend on each other, right? So basically, no matter if your teams are small or big, but the communication structure will be mirrored to software, right? And if that teams are small, that could mean microservices, and if that teams are big, fat departments, that could be in a monolithic architecture, right? So that's important to keep in mind because that's the very first thing about dependencies, right? Dependencies are created because of the team structures, and sometimes the teams cannot think beyond the structure, right? And create different ways of software, right? So either you need to change that thinking that you can create and you can ship software in different ways, or sometimes you need to really to change the team structure, right? So that's the first important thing when we talk about dependencies. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, right, and I found this really nowadays being one big problem, right, for dependencies is the release calendar or release trains, right? So let me explain what that means, right? So you probably saw the Spotify engineering video where they talk about release trains, or you may be familiar with SAFe when we talk about scaling agile to the enterprise, right? So to be completely clear, it's definitely better to release software every 2 weeks than every 6 weeks, or then every month or every 6 months, right? So the issue is that people achieve that cadence and they stop. They don't try to go faster, right? Because they couple the idea of a release and deploy. Release and deploy are different things, right? So you might want to deploy in production every day, not necessarily you want to make that visible to your users every day, right? And it's so important to be in production because it's really hard to replicate that environment in other places. It's expensive, and there's so many other reasons, right? But really, if you're not going to production, you might be entirely fooled by problems, right, that you might be thinking which is okay, which are not, right? So I simply want to say that release calendars and release trains are evil, right? And one other thing they are paired with it is this like a management thinking, right, instead of a product thinking. So in project thinking or management thinking, you're probably gonna think about project terms, meaning Did I deliver on time, on scope, on budget, right? And the thing is like this, right? You're always gonna deliver on time if you are delivering every 2 weeks, right? You're always gonna deliver on budget because nobody gonna run over budget, right? And at least yearly, right? So you're gonna increase the budget, but from one year to another, not on that year. So what happens? It is that these calendars, they give you this fake feeling that everything is okay because every 2 weeks something is happening, all right? But my question is, are we doing better every 2 weeks? Are we adding more value? Are we getting more customers? Are we fixing technical debt, right? Or we're just, on that same review cadence, right? Are we doing anything but in a regular review cadence, right? That's the difference, is a difference between review cadence and value added, right? So that's one thing. And I feel like these release calendars are holding all sorts of other issues, right? Because you're not trying to increase your release cadence, and then slowly your productivity is going down. You're not even realizing, or you kind of accept it as it is, right? And I just don't want to make it all about productivity, right? Because I believe there's other important things like value for other or for users, your user base growth, your portfolio growth, you have better solutions, and your maintenance cost goes down. And all these things are hard if you are in sort of only doing things in 2 weeks, right? Because that is like established bottleneck or established buffer. And of course, you could do nothing and ignore the problem, right? And keep pretending that everything is fine and demanding people to deliver things on time, all right? But definitely that will not be a good strategy for retention. And we can talk about possible solutions, right? And I don't believe these are real solutions. Maybe to some specific cases, all right, like startups, it maybe work, but honestly, I don't think this work anymore, right? So one thing that people always talk about is, full stack engineer. And people want to go full stack engineer because then there's a way to remove dependencies, right? But for me, this idea is completely flawed because it came from the idea of some stacks, like in Java used to have JSF, Java Server Faces, and something like Ruby on Rails, right? And these really technologies are kind of a dead, and they're not good technologies, right? And in Brazil, we say that we have the duck feelings, right? Because a duck is something that it doesn't swim well, it doesn't fly well, so it's a duck, right? And this myth of full stack engineers, because nowadays, like DevOps engineering is one thing, backend is another thing, front end is another thing, and the technology landscape is all about specialization, right? And I'm not pitching for high specialized solutions, right? I'm not saying a developer just know Java, a front end that just knows CSS, another guy who just know HTML, another guy who just know JavaScript. It's not hyper specialization, right? Which is an item anti pattern, right? I'm not advocating for that. I'm saying like front end and back end, for instance, are too big, right? And often, you really want to specialize, either to have a front end engineer and a back end engineer. It's hard to have someone doing both and doing both well, right? And that's I think the realization that if that's your plan to deal with dependencies, I think is a very flawed plan and will not work. And you're gonna fight against the market, right? Because engineers, backend don't want to do front end, and front end don't want to do backend. For sure, there's people that are curious, all right, but to have expertise doing both, this is pretty hard. And I think it works when you have like a smaller scale or niche startup, all right. But in average enterprise level, I don't think this idea flies at all. The other thing you need to be careful, right? And I feel like we are failing in one of these failure modes, right? Which is either a monolith, right? Or a distributed monolith. And distributed monolith, you could call it as microservices, right? So either people do microservices for all the things, or they do a monolith for all the things. And this is kind of the discussion nowadays. I'm gonna have a mono repo for the whole company with everything there, right? Like Google and Facebook, because yes, I don't have 2 billion lines of code, right? But that's what I should do. Or oh no, I'm gonna create microservices for every single thing, right? And both are wrong. Services, I think they can have different granularity, right? But if your answer is that same pattern for all the questions, for all the problems, definitely gonna be in the wrong spot, right? So I don't think the answer is blindly having microservices for everything or monolith for everything. And I think that's the opposite. And this will create dependency issues, right? If you do not right size your services, right? And I think here it's really hard to have a magical wand and have a one single solution for everything. You kind of need to model, right? You kind of need to do DDD for all scenarios and see what makes sense, what doesn't, right? But for sure, I can tell you both streams, it will be problematic, right? So let's talk about real solutions, right? Solutions that it works, that are tested. I personally use these solutions in my past career, and I still use them, and I believe they are just great. So the first thing you should be considering is the inner sourcing module, right? Popularized by GitHub and Microsoft, where the idea is like, well, if you're using repositories, right, something like Git, and you have like a GitHub in your company, or you have any other community based or social coding solution, and you basically can allow other teams to open PRs to you, and they fix their needs. They add the features they need, or they fix the bugs they need, right? And the cool thing about that is that you spread knowledge by doing that, right? And you still have centralized ownership, so the team who owns that component, you're gonna merge that PR, right? And you also gonna avoid some management coordination, because you would not need to have managers or PMs or EMs, to be negotiating scope in sprints and backlogs, right? Because your team is executing, right? So that really reduces the friction and their good side effects of it, right? So I think that's one great way to deal with dependencies, is to have inner sourcing, right? So that's one great approach and technique. The second thing, and I desperately believe organizations need this badly, right? Because we have this bad mindset of throwing the baby with the bathwater, right? Which is, when we throw away SOA, we throw away governance, right? So governance is always bad, and the word governance, it means bureaucracy and bad things, right? Well, no. One thing we had in SOA was contract, right? And I do not mean you need to use Swagger or OpenAPI or Pact or any of these tools to do contract testing, right? If you have a contract and your team maintains that contract, it means purely that you have SOA and product thinking, right? So you are thinking about that asset as a product in a long term. So you are thinking about SLOs, you're thinking about maintaining that contract. And in SOA, a contract means the data, the expectations, the behavior, the protocols, the format of the data, a lot of things, right? And you maintaining that things, it make more reliable for other teams. And if you are maintaining more than one version, let's say you maintain 3 versions at the same time, you're giving some sort of a release window for the teams to migrate, and they don't need to deal with the change and be breaking all the time, right? So they just give more time for them to accommodate changes, right? So you don't need contract testing to that. And honestly, contract testing, if you have tests on the server, right, and you maintain a contract, there's nothing wrong with that. Often contract tests fail and people keep putting that on tools. It's not about the tools. It's about to have a contract and have SOA governance mentality, right? Because if you maintain the contract, all right, you really care about your consumers, It doesn't matter that your tests are centralized on the server. The problem is not to have the test being tested on the client. That's not really the case. The case is to have the SOA, the product mentality, right? And that's one hell of a way to deal with dependencies, right? Because not only you are giving some leverage that's gonna be stable for people, right? So you are fixing stability issues, but also often you're gonna have better documentations with either with documentation or working code. And if you do the contract first, implementation later, that easily could be a way to deal with dependencies, because then the backend doesn't need to be done, so the front end can call it, or even backend to backend, right? If one service is gonna call another and has the contract, it can fake, it can mock, it can stub that contract, right? And when the contract done, you can remove the contract, right? So that gives you power to parallelization, right? And that's about contracts and SOA and governance. The other thing that's a kind of a missing discipline, right, is DDD, domain-driven design. And the thing is this, in DDD, there are many concepts, right, but there's this concept of context maps and bounded context, right, where you could restructure your themes to be, instead of a function based, they could be domain based, right? And most of people don't do that because they think there's issues with reuse, or they never do reorgs, right? But the thing is this, right? One very effective way to deal with dependencies is to reorging your organization, right? And have this exercise to see where things should be. And instead of having things for function, having things per domain. And then you're going to have the function embedded on each domain, right? And that ideas, they were kind of a popular, like, I don't know, like 10 years ago, and people were calling it like a cross-functional teams. They were pitching for this idea, is a very DDD idea, and now this is kind of a lost, like people often don't talk much about that. I made a post recently talking about data meshes for big data, and one thing that got me excited about it is they were finally talking about governance and team structure, and they were talking about the same ideas, and I feel this is really the right path to go. But it's not only for big data, right? For services, we need the same thing. For services, for platforms, we need to think teams more towards a domain rather than a function. Amazon has similar philosophy, right? But they call it two pizza teams. And for me, this is a bit deceiving because people just get like, the simple things. Oh, it's a small team, right? No, it's not about a small team per se. For me, it's not like the size of the team that matters, right? Either because you should be fed with pizza is a poor health, right? Habit. But the thing is like this, right? Two pizza teams on Amazon model, they own the customer experience, right? And it's all about ownership as well, right? In order to have ownership, you need to have Slack, right? Otherwise, you don't have ownership. And I'm not talking about the communication tool, right? I'm talking about having time to do things that are not only features, right? So another important things to deal with dependencies is to have the philosophy of lean shared libraries. And very few people think about this, right? Often people just think, okay, I want to do code reuse and that's it. And that's how services became distributed monolith and have more and more dependencies. And that's why your chronograms, your schedules, your Gantt charts are falling down the cliff, all right? And you need to have as less dependencies as possible. You need to minimize the binary dependencies and need to minimize shared libraries and need to leverage services, because services in platforms and CLIs and sidecars, they are less intrusive than binary dependencies. They're a bit harder to do, for sure, but they're much easier to maintain on a long run, and they provide greater flexibility, right? And we need to understand that we need governance on libraries. Often no company has governance on libraries, and we need to understand that duplication is fine. there's no problem with duplication, all right? We are not duplicating business rules. We're often duplicating configurations or preferences, all right? And that's not really a big deal. And there's other ways we could be shipping that, right? Either through documentation or specification or CLI generators or sidecars or services, right? But we need to stop thinking that binary libraries are the answer for all the problems. And that's also why things get slow and we have dependency issues with the teams, all right? So that's an important thing that need to be tackled. The other thing that's really important and helps with this issue of code duplication, all right, is to use self-service platforms. And it doesn't matter if you are using, you are piggy banking on a cloud provider like AWS, like in Aurora or Lambda or S3, right? Or you are building your own infrastructure solutions in Jenkins, right? So you need to have this idea to have generic platforms that people ideally don't need to code. Ideally, they just consume as services, right? And if they need to customize, then they do code, right? But otherwise, you should not be code first, right? You should be usage first, right? And that matters a lot. Not only to piggyback on existing solutions, all right, leverage managed services, but create your own infrastructure solutions as managed service. In that way, when you organize by domain, that will reduce the friction of duplication code, right, and you speed up things. And what we can see here in common of most of the things I'm talking about is all about leveraging architecture. And architecture not only going in sense of a technical solution, but also looking for things, for governance, for structure, all right? So that's it for today. I hope you guys like my slidecast. See you next time. Take care. Cheers.